One, two, 3.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Local Youth Worker, a podcast brought to you by Reformed Youth Ministries. I'm your host, John Parrott. I am here with Scott Heron and Linda Oliver. Scott, Linda, how's it going?
Hey, it's going well.
Hey, John.
I always love that awkward intro where everyone's trying not to talk over each other and interrupt and all that good stuff. So today we're going to be talking about volunteers. If you've listened to this podcast long enough, you know we've talked about volunteers periodically. Episode 369 is a specific episode I'd point people back to that was entitled Youth Ministry FAQs and Pro Tips. We had Susan, Andrew, and John joining us who were in St. Louis, Missouri, serving at, I think, the Kirk. I'd point you back a lot of good wisdom from them. And I know there's been some other episodes where we've talked about volunteers. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about recruiting volunteers and kind of practically what that looks like. How do you attract the right volunteers? We're going to be talking about some of our biggest mistakes in recruiting volunteers, and who knows what else we'll talk about. We might get into just a lot of different things. I thought we could start off by just asking you guys, how did you utilize volunteers in ministry? Linda, how did you utilize volunteers? Scott, how are you currently utilizing volunteers? Linda, you want to start off with us?
Sure. So, different churches and youth groups I've been at have done this differently, right? Kind of depending on needs and staff structures and whatnot. So I've seen all sorts of things. One of the most common ways, obviously, we use volunteers is in leading small groups. But then there can be other smaller roles for a Wednesday or Sunday program where it might be helping with some smaller details that have to do with like setup or just things that help the program run. Maybe someone who's helping run slides or doing music, like what's the word I'm looking for? Like behind the board, making the sound work and whatnot. But then you think about trips and events, and those are kinds of things that you would draw a lot of extra volunteers into. And of course, if you want to include the category of something like a committee, where parents and others might speak into some of the vision and overall kind of decisions of the ministry, that would be another place I've seen volunteers used. So it can really be a broad variety of things, I would say.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I could add anything to that. Those are the same ways that we utilize our volunteers, prayer group leaders, and that's the big one. Certainly we have needs behind the scenes, just like Linda was saying, setting up for meals or certain events, things like that. But yeah, and retreats and other things like that. So I sometimes what I'm trying to do is I'd like to start looking for some volunteers who could help teach a little more. That's an area that I haven't had a lot of, I guess, maybe success in finding someone who wants to do that. I think they see sometimes what we do on a Wednesday or a Sunday morning, depending on when Sunday or whatever night you do youth group, and they're like, I don't want to do that. But that's something that I've been thinking about, praying about, is that just to get some other voices in front of the kids. So,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of wisdom there, and I'm glad you brought up your prayer groups because I've been able to go out and visit you in Montana and got to observe that, and it was just neat after a large group teaching time how you guys split up, and then you got some more intimate time to share prayer requests and have leaders doing that. It was so cool to witness. I think, similarly to what you guys have talked about, teaching was always a big way that I utilize people, both in Sunday school and then small groups on Wednesday nights. One of the things that I did that seemed to be helpful was whatever book study we were going through, I would try to read and just outline the chapter that they were going to be teaching on a week ahead of time, and just kind of give them, hey, here's the main points of the chapter. Here's some things you can utilize. Go off of this, do whatever you want. But that would often help those who felt like, okay, they're busy, they've got a lot going on, they don't know how much time they could devote to that. But that would be just something I would try to do to encourage the teachers. Transportation was another big one. Oftentimes for our fall retreat, we would go somewhere that was about an hour away from our church, and we wanted to minimize student drivers, just liability reasons, all that. Sometimes it was late when people were coming, and so getting parents to help drive. We also had a big Christmas party, and we would do a pancake breakfast that night. We'd dress in pajamas, and they'd cook pancakes, and parents would do all the cooking. And you mentioned the youth committee, Linda. I would try to encourage our youth committee to reach out to people that might not feel comfortable teaching or driving, but they can flip pancakes. And so try to find, different ways in which other parents could get involved, from, uh, serving pancakes at a breakfast. And yeah, just hospitality was another thing, having parents open their home to uh, invite the youth in and have different, parties and things like that. So those are some of the ways that I try to utilize volunteers, and something too. And I'd love for you guys to react to what I just said. But I think early on, I was I was intimidated by volunteers and probably insecure about volunteers because I felt like this was my territory and was being controlling, and I was kind of cautious of how I would reach out to people and really just kind of thinking I could do it on my own. So I'm just curious, react to any of the things I just said about utilizing volunteers, but then also that just, did you ever kind of go through that time of just being a little hesitant about volunteers?
Yeah, I started youth ministry in a place where we had such a large staff that there were less roles that we had to rely on volunteers for. And so even the idea of a volunteer teaching Sunday school, that would probably happen. Like I could count on one hand the number of times that would happen in a year because we just had so much staff, right? And so I came out of a place thinking like, oh yeah, like the staff are the people who like run the youth ministry. But then I went to a much smaller church, and it was so common for us to bring volunteers in for those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, I just have seen, especially maybe in one of my contexts, this tendency for us to think like, oh, like, I'm not really sure if there's anyone in the church that quite fits like what I'm looking for in a youth leader. And so I just don't really want to like ask anybody because I want to like keep control over like, we've got the people who have the right, like, I don't know, theological views and the right, like, personality to connect with students and whatever like combination of things it is, instead of thinking like, man, like it is my job to equip the saints for ministry, and I can help equip these people to shape the kind of, make them more into the kind of volunteers I would like them to be over the long term, right? Like if they need some theological education or whatever, they're like, let's be the ones who help equip them in that, and entrust this ministry to the congregation as a whole, because we're all called to be a part of it.
Yeah, that's so good, Linda. As both of you are talking, I'm thinking, yeah, John, you mentioned a couple things that made me reminded me that I do. We have parents make dinners every Wednesday for the junior high group, which is, I guess, technically a volunteer role. It's not an official, youth leadership uh, team role, but and Linda, what you said about your second church, that's kind of where I started, was a small church, and I had to come in and basically figure things out from scratch. Like there was only four of us on staff at the time, and the other two were full time. They were co-senior pastors, and I was an associate, and so nobody was involved with youth ministry except for me, and I was intimidated, John, big time. Like I remember thinking, how on earth am I going to find anybody who wants to be a part of this program? And so I I uh, I actually just kind of took whoever the first couple of years, but the Lord was faithful in that, and we didn't have any. I turned out I made my mistakes later with volunteers, not in those first couple of years of developing. But like Linda's saying, it is our job to equip the saints for ministry, and discipleship is such an important part of what we do in youth ministry. And so finding those leaders, it's not easy, that's for sure. We also, the other thing you mentioned, John, it reminded me that I'm having high school kids lead. So most of our leaders, we have a few adults, but most of our leaders over the junior high are high school kids, and they are teaching. We're doing the Church 101, which we talked about last time, I think, in the podcast. And I think, Linda, you had a big part of that, right? Writing that one.
Yep.
And it's
I'm
going
just
well.
going to
Just to encourage you.
interject. Just going to interject and
Of
say
course
she
you
didn't
are.
just have she didn't just have a part in that. She wrote the whole thing. So that's all.
Okay, that's
She's
what I
not
thought,
gonna say
actually. Yeah. Yeah. I was trying to be modest for her, but so it's going well. The kids are really liking it. I even had a couple of parents say that their kids are remembering things. So the curriculum's working well. But anyway, all that to say, it's always, John, I think, intimidating to try to find leaders.
Yeah, for sure. And there's many valid concerns that we're expressing here, or kind of in some ways tiptoeing around. And I think some of those concerns we can kind of get into more specifically, because I'm glad, just to affirm or reiterate what you both are saying, and point to the specific scripture, Ephesians 4:11-13, when we're talking about equipping the saints. That's a biblical command. And so we need to be able to say kind of strongly, volunteers that's a biblical concept. That's a biblical command. And we should be striving as, if we're talking to youth workers specifically, God has placed this youth ministry under our stewardship. And one of the ways we can faithfully steward that is by, equipping the saints to help us. And there's so much, not only just biblical wisdom on, again, we've got this command here, but all of us, I like Mark DeVries. He said something in his book, Sustainable Youth Ministry, that we're all interims, meaning we will all be replaced. Those of you listening to this right now, if you're serving in student ministry, someone's going to replace you. You're not going to be there forever. And if we're building a youth ministry around us, around our personalities, once we leave, that can have some negative impact on the students that are under us. But if we have volunteers around us who are remaining after we go, that really can help the ministry continue to move forward. And so not only just biblical command here, but biblical wisdom on why we need to be equipping the saints for this type of ministry. And so, yes, let's affirm why we need to do this, but let's get into some cautions. And I know it's about time to take a break. So how about on the other side of the break, let's share some of our biggest recruiting mistakes, and then give some cautions, and then kind of how do we attract the right volunteers? We'll just discuss that a little bit. So let's take a break, and then we'll be back with more with Scott and Linda.
Hello, my name is John Revell. I'm the youth and family pastor at Lakeland Presbyterian Church, and I'm the author of RYM's newest series, Grace 101. In composing this series of lessons, I really had two main goals or thoughts. One was I wanted to make sure that as much scripture as possible made its way into these lessons. I wanted to make sure these lessons were just permeated by the scriptures, because, of course, the scriptures are our ultimate source of truth and authority, but also the scriptures just have so much to say about this topic, this reality of grace. After all, it is grace that is at the foundation of our relationship with God. And so there's just so much there in the scriptures that I think we can easily lose sight of many passages, because we'll focus on other passages that are maybe more well known. We think that because we know a handful of passages that talk about grace, that we have it maybe all figured out, but there's just so much else in the scriptures, and I wanted to bring those things in. Secondly, I wanted to bring certain ideas into conversation. I wanted to be able to distinguish things, separate things, but also bring harmony between things. Things like justification and sanctification, ideas like common grace and saving grace. When we think of grace, works, law, faith, effort, all of those things that very often we either separate or pit against each other. I think there's a lot of harmony between these things, and And so I do that a good bit throughout the series as well. So I do hope and pray that this series is helpful for you in your walk with Christ, that it would be encouraging and edifying and glorifying to Jesus Christ our Lord. Thank you.
All right, I am back here with Scott Heron and Linda Oliver. And I know, again, you guys are on the podcast consistently, but just reminding our listeners, Scott, you're out in Bozeman, Montana. Linda, you are in Orlando, Florida. We're recording on 3 different time zones today. So yeah, we're talking about volunteers. I think about volunteers in my ministry. I've said there were 3 guys who were some of the most consistent and solid volunteers. And I've told them before, and the awesome thing is I'm still friends with these guys today. They probably added 5 years to my ministry. That, again, going back early in ministry, I wanted to be the one doing this, and I was intimidated to bring anybody else in who might be more gifted than I am at something. But as I got older and more grouchy and fatigued and all of that, I was happy to welcome people that, man, they can connect with this student in a way I cannot. They have this gift I do not, and I need them. And, it just became vital for my ministry. At the same time, we've talked about, we've got to be cautious. We've got to be careful about the people that we invite into the ministry. And as I've heard people say before, never put an announcement in the church bulletin of, hey, volunteers needed, because you could get some people that you just totally don't want helping out in the ministry. And as I've heard other people say, it is very hard to fire a volunteer. And I can remember, just as we're starting to get into mistakes, and Linda and Scott, I want y'all to chime into this. There was a small group leader I had one time who was a very faithful leader and gifted in a lot of ways and a blessing. But one time I had chosen a book that we were going through that was a little, theologically technical and got into some just kind of difficulties, but at the same time, our students were kind of interested in this. And what I discovered was that this small group leader was kind of talking critically about the book, talking critically about me, and kind of critical about the idea of even talking about this in youth ministry. And one of the students in the class told their parents, and their parents called me and said, hey, you just need to be aware that in this class, this volunteer is saying this about you. And that was such an uncomfortable conversation I had to have with that volunteer. And, it wasn't heated. It was cordial. It was awkward for both of us of, hey, look, I know this is kind of technical. At the same time, put a lot of thought into why we're doing this. Our youth committee kind of signed off on this, and I really need you to support me behind the scenes. Come talk to me if you have problems with it, but don't talk to students. And so that was just really uncomfortable. And I think kind of shortly after that, this person never volunteered to teach anymore. And, there was just that awkwardness. So, that's just some awkwardness that can come from volunteers. And that's just a story that kind of comes to mind. Linda, just curious, react to that story, any stories you have, any mistakes you can think of, and then Scott, you can jump into.
Yeah, that reminds me of one time years ago, had a volunteer, or maybe it was 2 volunteers that were kind of stirring up some discontent amongst students about our church and its worship style. In general, I'd say that's what it was about. And, I think we should have leaders that have differences of opinions on things. That's fine. And it's fine for, people to even hold different theological positions on minor issues, not on the gospel, but on tertiary issues than us, and even talk with students about that. But there's a way to do that which doesn't stir up negative feelings towards the church or towards its leaders in unnecessary ways, where we can say hey, it's okay for us to disagree on this. Here's my opinion. And I think it's okay for someone, like in your instance, for example, to like pick up a book and be like, I have a preference for books that are like a little less technical because it's hard for me to like connect with this. But like, it's a different thing when they're saying like, hey, yeah, like John's an idiot for picking this book, or like what, I don't know what they were saying, like those are like the things that you have to like address. Sometimes it can be difficult, and that's unfortunately what sometimes like people can be doing if they're kind of like stirring that up amongst students. And I think it's a maturity issue often with the leaders that this comes up with. And so that's where you really have to be careful about who you're choosing maturity wise, and do they have the ability to kind of navigate these kinds of things with wisdom and discernment. I think I've also run into stuff where I don't know, we just we made the mistake of like not communicating with our volunteers enough, or not equipping them well enough. It was like there would be one meeting at the beginning of the semester. Hey, here's the curriculum we're going through. Here's what the night looks like. And like, that's it. We would never do anything else with our volunteers. And I just think that was like a huge missed opportunity.
Yeah, yeah. That was, man, that's so good. I think of the mistakes I've made in two different categories, and Linda, you started to hit on these, but the first mistake I think I've made in recruiting is maybe I'm just thinking of a couple different situations over the last 10 years, and I think it's the biggest mistake I've made in recruiting was so our church has a policy you can't work with children unless you're a member. And so that's the first roadblock, which is kind of nice actually, and because it means that you need to buy into the vision and you know who we are as a church and submit to that. And so that's a good first step. But I have over the years, we have this process of becoming a member, right? So if someone is in process of becoming a member, I've allowed them to start working with permission from some, the other pastors, and that I'm not going to do again. I'm going to make sure that they're fully a member first, because I can run into some issues there. And I think the reason why is because the other mistake I make in recruiting is like assuming the best about someone too quickly. Just assuming maybe because they have lots of energy and they demonstrate a love for kids, or they're there a couple of times to kind of check out what we're doing, and they really connected quickly. And so I'm just kind of like, well, sign them up, right? And instead of like, hey, let's see, let's give you a couple more interactions and let's get to know you a little bit more. And as a result, I had two situations, but one in particular, and like you said, John, firing a volunteer is like really, it's the worst, um, because it's like you're gonna deliver news, like you're not even, you know, it's like you're letting me go from a position that I'm, I agreed to do for free, right? There's no compensation or anything. It's like and it kind of inadvertently sends a message like, wow, I'm that bad, which that's not what you're trying to communicate.
Yeah.
But I had a young lady who was working with the teenage girls, and over time, what it kind of came out was that she was needing something from these kiddos. She was needing their affirmation. She was needing their almost friendship, I guess you would say. And she started to do these sidebar on her own youth gatherings. And we have co-leaders, so I always have two leaders over each group of students. And she would organize events with the girls without her co-leader and without telling me. And it just got really difficult. So that was not fun. And the mistake I made was, there were red flags, and there were other volunteers that kind of came to me and said, "Hey, this person is doing this, and just be aware." And I gave her grace, and I just waited too long, and it just became really difficult to say, "Hey, I don't think this is working." So that's one of the biggest mistakes I've made. The other is just in discipling our leaders, like Linda was talking about. Man, I too often communicate too late. I don't follow up with them on meetings like I need to. We've tried to do trading books in the past, and I always let those fizzle out. So I just there's so many mistakes I've made in like trying to keep their energy up and keep their love for the kids. But some reason they keep sticking around. So those are things I wish I would do a better job of.
Yeah, no, those are good things. And look, I mean, you said so much. I'd love for you maybe just briefly talk about why you have co-leaders. That is so wise, and that's huge to do that. But maybe just kind of elaborate a little bit on why you think it's good to have co-leaders together.
Yeah. So one of the things we value is just the longevity of relationships with students. And so the first reason I think we have co-leaders is because if you come into our youth ministry and you start with a group of sixth graders, I want you to be with them for the next 6 years till they graduate. And so that increases the percentage that one of those two leaders will be there for that whole time, right? So that's one of the reasons. The other is it just it's a safety thing too, just like I mean, I don't worry about it if one of the leaders is gone and they take the kiddos and they do their prayer group because they're not one on one with a kid in some corner of the building. They're with the other students, but it just in general, it's a safety issue. And also, you know, we don't, they can't make it every week. And so if you have, I tell my leaders, try to make 3 Wednesdays out of 4 a month. If you can't make 3 out of 4, then we probably should talk. I have made a few exceptions where there's a couple of volunteers who can do 2 a month, but we got the co-leader, right? So that person's filling in. And the other I think is just so important is that we just shouldn't do any of this alone, right? And recruiting, especially when it comes to recruiting volunteers. So any of you are youth pastors who are listening, probably a lot of you, and you're thinking about recruiting people, don't do it alone. Get help, get other people's input. That way, you don't have the full responsibility of, if it goes poorly, you got input ahead of time. Maddie, our girls director, I will always run a name by her before I ever like call the person and even talk to them about it. But so the co-leader thing has been good because everybody has different gifts, right? And I've got in our group of sophomore boys, we've got 12 sophomore boys just in that group, and so I can't do that by myself. I need Bruce to help me, and he's going to connect with some of those boys in ways that I'm not going to connect with them. And so it's just really, really good to have two. So, but the downside is like that's a ton of work then. So, because now I've got to have double the leaders, right? Instead of just, one leader for each prayer group, I have two. So we have 26 volunteers for the whole youth ministry.
Man, that's a lot. That's a lot of good wisdom there. I think if I had to maybe highlight just one of the mistakes that I made, it would be just kind of not stewarding them well. And, it was kind of like once I got them to sign up for the small group or whatever it was kind of like, okay, yes, they're in place. Now it's kind of hands off. And, typically when they'd show up on a Wednesday night, we'd have 80 or so kids and it's chaos and it's insane and I'm not able to give them time. And so just kind of like we would go through the semester. And so I think I could have celebrated them more. I could have encouraged them more. I could have just interacted with them better. And so I think it's important to really celebrate them and to treat them and really thinking back to that episode I referenced earlier with Susan, John, and Andrew. They talk about how what a good job John Spencer does in celebrating volunteers. So that'd be something I'd point people back to. And you're both talking about a lot of good things of us being cautious with. I mean, the maturity issue, in so many different ways. I mean, from Linda, from your story, Scott, yours as well. But, you can get volunteers that struggle with what we all can struggle with, and that is trying to look cool in front of youth and trying to be accepted by them instead of speaking a hard word or speaking a word of caution, if it was talking about the worship or whatever. And that can be a tough situation to be in. But having those leaders that are mature to realize, okay, look, I'm going to sacrifice some coolness here by being a mature Christian and saying this, instead. And so maybe let's talk about some of those qualities we look for in a volunteer, some of those just gifts that we may try to focus in on. As you guys have tried to pick volunteers throughout the years, what are some of those things that you've looked for in volunteers? Linda, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I think paying attention to their character and spiritual maturity is the first thing you've got to think about. And, when we were talking about even doing this topic as an episode, part of what made me think of it is there's several old episodes when in the first season you were asking youth leaders, what's one of the worst things or one of the biggest mistakes you've made in youth ministry? And there were a number of them that said, I was not vigilant enough in who I was choosing as leaders. And for the most part, those answers had to do with, it was someone whose character and spiritual maturity in the end turned out to not be, as high as we would have liked for it to have been. And I think a lot of us who have been in youth ministry for more than a few years can think of examples of that we've seen as well, where ultimately these volunteers, maybe they seemed good for a time, they connected well with students, they had a heart for students in some way, but there's some way in which they were not the most godly example, or we cringe now at the fact that students are probably still following them on Instagram and like, what are they posting there? I've seen that even in former staff. I think we have to think first about their character and their spiritual maturity. I want to find the kind of people that, what's that verse in Acts that's like, they knew that they had been with Jesus, right? Like I want to find those kinds of people that would fit that description. And then, yes, we do have to have people that it seems like they're going to connect with students. Because I don't want it to be a place full of volunteers that students are just going to be like, what is up with these weird people that don't get me? It has to be a place students want to come to. And so, who can connect with students? I remember a few years ago, I heard someone talking about this and they said, generally, most volunteers are probably going to think that they would rather do high school than middle school ministry, but they might not be right. Because if you find someone who's a really, really good kind of encourager, kind of cheerleader personality, that's going to make a great middle school leader. And if you find someone who's a really good listener, who knows what it's like to walk through suffering, who's not going to, just be the energetic encourager person, but like can really listen well to students and kind of counsel them, like that is someone who will be really great with high schoolers. And I think you have to pay attention to the culture of your own youth group too. Like who's going to fit in with your youth group? I've definitely, even in like hiring interns and stuff, seen people who I thought, man, this would be a great youth leader at another church, but it's not that great of a fit for the culture of our youth ministry. And it's okay to just like own that, and talk with someone about like, hey, like, is this going to be a fit? Or would you fit somewhere else better? And then you just want someone who's going to be available and faithful. Like Scott was talking about, especially if there's someone who can be like a long-term volunteer, like look for someone who can be faithful. And I think that can come in all sorts of different ages. I don't want, kind of back to the first point, I don't want to put just the youngest, least mature people in the church in front of my teens. I want to put a variety of ages in front of them. I want them to have intergenerational influences on them. And so that can be a lot of different things that you're looking for there. But yeah, those are some of the things I look for.
Yeah, that's good. And I want to come back to the, obviously spiritual maturity, number one, but then also the balance of not just getting these people that, yeah, may be spiritually mature, but they're also not fun. And of course, we need to be cautious with emphasizing fun, but at the same time, it is important. And it is something that's youth ministry specifically needs to consider. And so maybe we can come back to that a little bit. But Scott, what are some things you look for in a volunteer?
Yeah, man, Linda, that's so good. Why don't you want the youngest, least mature in front of your students? I'm sorry, I missed that part. When you said that, Linda, it made me think about our age range, and I did a quick mental inventory. I've got leaders who are 16 and leaders who are 60. That's pretty cool.
Wow.
So I agree with you. The age range is so important. Um, so just some real practical things that I've tried to implement over the years. The first, I mentioned this before, is that they need to be a church member, um, and and that's just important because this person has stood in front of the congregation, taken vows, and said, I'm committed." So that's stage one of being faithful, right? And then our church kind of has this policy, so I've adopted it as well, which is, future leaders are current leaders, and so like let's say we're looking for a deacon, right? Well, what we do is we sit down and we say, well, who's deaconing already, right? Who's doing that? So when it comes to youth workers, I'll look around on Sunday and I'll like, okay, who are some older or adults that maybe are talking to students on Sunday morning, or if it's student leaders, who over the years has said, hey, Scott, can I help put tables away or put tables back out or things like that. So just people who are willing to serve are already serving, and so that's an important part of what I look for. Of course, spiritual maturity is so important, but I think for me, one of the things that's if I were to like nail down a detail point on that is that spiritual maturity, sure, it's important for me if you are spending time in God's Word and you have a meaningful prayer life, and like you said, Lynn, they can tell they've been with Jesus. Those are all important. But I think more important than that is just simply the attitude of brokenness, where this person knows their need for Jesus. Like they understand their sin. It's not hard to talk about their struggles with them. Because that, going back to the mistake thing, that was one of the others that I had with one of the other people that I had to ask to step down, is that this person could never quite pinpoint where their struggle was to the point where it's like, oh yeah, and confess it even, right? And so just the knowing their brokenness is so important. Like I'll take somebody who knows their brokenness way before somebody who understands, Reformed doctrine, right? Um, and then I choose people I like to be with. So if somebody says, hey, so and so, you ought to think about, because people will come up and say, hey, so and so would be a good youth leader, and then I'm like, yeah, I mean, I like that person, but it's not like, do they get me? Do I get them? Are we friends, right? And so that's kind of important to me. Um, it's not the same with everybody that volunteers, but it's just important because we do dinners together, we hang out, we like to be together. And then, like I said before, I never recruit by myself. I always bring other people in on it, and then I never recruit from the pulpit or from the front, like or from the bulletin, like you said, John. Like it's just a bad idea to like cast that net, because then you just are like, it get even though you haven't told somebody yes to volunteer, it gives them a just like a false sense of hope, right? And they're like, oh Scott, I want to help, I want to help. What do I do? And then I'm like, well, let's see. We'll talk about it, right? And then, so I just kind of do one-on-one. So we just have conversations about it frequently. We go through the church directory. Um, I've had leaders that led in the past who maybe decided to stop leading, and so they've been off for a few years. I will always go back to them first. Can you come back next year? Because I've already got that relationship established, and there is somebody that I can trust. So those are some of the things that I try to practice when it comes to to recruiting.
Yeah, there's a lot of good wisdom there, and I do like. I mean, just the point of someone you like to be around. I mean, we need to think of
Yeah.
anytime, I mean, we're on staff at our church or we work anywhere, the people we work with are vitally important, that we mesh well with those people. And so as you're thinking of recruiting a volunteer, that does factor into, I mean, just personality and all that. That's not something to overlook. I think just some random thoughts to share as you guys are speaking. I think it's important to give volunteers a break. That I had a volunteer who specifically wanted to teach every small group, like we'd have just kind of a big small group in the fall, basically, and then a big one in the spring. And they just were always wanting to be in that rotation. And there were times I welcomed that and times that I wanted them to do that. And then other times I had to say, look, I love that you're wanting to do this, but I'm going to force you to take a break because I don't want you to burn out. And so even if we've got an eager volunteer who's accessible, coming, all that, still give them breaks, because I've definitely seen those volunteers who were never given a break and they totally got burned out and then they didn't come back. And so we need to be thinking about giving breaks, and that's one way we can steward our volunteers. Yeah, going back, Linda, to kind of what you were saying of, yes, somebody who's spiritually mature, but then someone who's fun as well. It seems like as we're talking about teaching, this being just a major focus of volunteers, that we do have to be selective about those people that we're going to have up front actually teaching the word. And that sometimes we need to realize, okay, here's a volunteer I'm going to utilize who's more fun, but I'm probably never going to use them in a teaching scenario. It's more of kind of, I want to say, crowd control on a Wednesday night or playing ultimate frisbee or whatever, something along those lines. But then you also need someone who can, teach in a way that's not going to be boring, who's, spiritually mature, but also can be funny and lighthearted with students. And I've heard from students before who say, yeah, I guess they're kind of a good teacher, but it's also just kind of dry and boring. And so any thoughts you guys have there, either one of you, of just kind of recruiting the right personality type, and any thoughts there, just react to what I just said, Linda or Scott.
Well, John, you just said so many good things. I don't know if there's much to add. That's probably why we're both hesitating. But you unpacked so many things that volunteers do that as you were talking, I'm thinking, how do we find anybody to do this? Right?
Yeah.
It's really remarkable, honestly. It really is.
Yeah. And I think some of it too, sometimes is, realizing that it will be very rare for us to find a volunteer who's going to check all those boxes perfectly anyway. I mean, obviously we're all broken and none of us are perfect, but kind of giving volunteers the opportunity to maybe mess up a little bit, to fail a little bit, to also, grow. And specifically talking about teaching here, I cringe when I think about some of the early lessons that I taught students, and it's like, Lord, please make them forget all of that. And please, it's terrifying. And so thinking of people who this isn't their full-time job, and they're loving students enough to show up and to do this. Trying to encourage them in that, and trying to, maybe have those meetings of, hey, I was able to kind of sit in and watch this, and I noticed you did this. Here's something I might want to encourage you on, kind of having those kind of teaching opportunities to your leaders, because chances are if they have a full-time job and they're not teaching anywhere else, they've got to grow in that. And so maybe that's just one thought, because I do think, there's just something about being present, and our students realize, they might not realize it when they're in youth ministry, but I hope that when the students are currently going through a ministry, but as they become young adults, as they get older, they can think back and think, you know what, this person had a full-time job and they showed up to teach me. And I don't remember any of the lessons, but I remember the fact that they actually cared enough to listen to me and to be around me. And that's something we need to emphasize. And so, any thoughts on that? Any other comments there? Or any other just random thoughts that have come to mind as we're talking, Linda?
Yeah, I just in terms of that, like who's going to connect with students thing. I mean, I would even just say, let's make sure we have different personalities of volunteers, right? So, like who's going to connect with students doesn't mean you're just looking for all the people who are like really energetic and crazy fun, right? Because you have the introverted students that are like overwhelmed when you put that person in front of them, and you need someone who can connect with them, right? You need people who can connect with the different personalities of students, right? So I would just caution some people, like, don't assume the people that can connect best with students are just the like extroverted personalities. Like, you need other types of personalities too. But one other thing I was just thinking about as well is just using parents as volunteers. And specifically when you're talking about more of kind of a small group leader volunteer, like it's really easy to use parents as like, oh, they're helping bring a meal or whatever. It gets a little more complicated sometimes to use them as small group leaders. And I want to be like clear about what I'm saying. Like, parents have sometimes been some of the best volunteers I have had. But at the same time, you kind of just have to be careful about where you place them if it's a small group leader type of role. Because I've seen situations where if that parent is their own child's small group leader, I think that can be a loss sometimes for the student. And I think sometimes that can create situations that are a little bit more complicated than you need them to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good word. And I think too, it's important for, our own children to hear from other people other than us and other teachers. And so, yeah, that's one aspect of that. But then, like you said, some other situations that can come up. Look, I know we're about to start wrapping this up. Scott, do you have any other just random thoughts that have come up from this? Any other nuggets of wisdom you'd like to share? And Linda, you too, before we close out.
Yeah. So I really like what Linda's saying about the diversity of leaders. I'm laughing. I was laughing kind of inside, smiling because I'm remembering that I've had students over the years, because I'm kind of that I mean, shocking, but I can be overwhelming. And I'm the extroverted person. And I've had students who come to our ministry, and they know their small group leader. They don't know my name. I'm the one up front. I'm the one doing everything. I'm giving the talk, but they still don't know who I am. But they're there to connect with their small group leader, and I love that. Like, that just makes me so happy, because if I try to, they'll like run away from me because they know that I'm just going to be loud and in their face, and like, no, I want to talk about the books I'm reading, and I want to, and I love that. So I'm really thankful for that. So that's really good, Linda. It's just it's a process that requires a lot of patience, a lot of prayer, and I think, if you're out there, you're looking to start recruiting volunteers. I think both of those are just really important, to be patient and to be prayerful, and the Lord will provide. I've had some top-notch leaders, like you mentioned, John, somebody who adds years to my ministry, right? Who have come to me at some point and say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I really need to not serve next year," and I get, that's stressful at some level. Like, how am I going to replace this person, right? Well, the Lord's faithful. He comes through, and He puts those people in the lives of these children who He wants there, and that's just really important to remember, I think. So.
Man, and I will say that is a great place to end, to point to the Lord's faithfulness, that He'll raise up leaders. He loves His church. He loves these students more than we do, and He will raise those people up. So yeah, that's a good word to end on. Scott, Linda, it's been great having this conversation. I appreciate you both, just your faithful labors for God's kingdom, and it's been great to talk about this. I know it's going to be a blessing to others.